Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Bek, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 158th episode. I have been following the work done by Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, CREA, for a few years. Truly admire the work CREA does in tracking and disseminating data and evidence on pollution and green transition. Lauri Myllyvirta is the co-founder of CREA, and I'm very pleased to have him on the podcast today. Lauri, welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you so much, Timer. Great to be here.
Great to have you, and thanks. I know you've been away on a holiday. This is your second day back, so I'm really grateful for you to take the time. Lauri, while both you and I were on vacation, the U.S. passed this big, beautiful bill. So I want to just start the conversation by getting a sense of your take on this bill, which has clearly some consequential provisions on supporting fossil fuel and some withdrawal on support for green energy. So what's your take?
First of all, I think the overall impact on the temperature in the room is, of course, big. The world's biggest economy, sending these kinds of signals, trying to go backwards. It's also much more serious than what Trump did during his first term. So, as we know, during Trump's first term, there was a lot of talk about how beautiful coal is and so on. But still more coal plants closed down during Trump's first term than during Obama's tenure. So it's more substantial. Now we're talking about actual measures to kneecap clean energy industries. It's however important to also remember that compared with Trump's first term, the clean energy technologies have progressed in leaps and bounds. So they're much more competitive without the tax credits. For example, I think the biggest impact will be on clean energy manufacturing in the U.S. So the big ambition during the Biden administration was to build a domestic clean energy manufacturing industry. In the U.S., we know, of course, from the examples of other countries that requires a vibrant domestic market and one with a robust outlook, which you don't have to the same degree with this kind of an administration. And then, of course, the tax credit is the one that the removal of the tax credit for wind and solar and the fiscal support for EVs is the one that affects the bottom line of a lot of companies. So financial analysts will focus on that, but the steps to increase the hoops that you have to jump through for permitting is a bigger one and harder to quantify. So if it's harder to get permissions for wind farms, for transmission lines, which are of course essential. Then that will also slow things down and direct things differently. One thing that we've seen is that when governments don't act, then it's much more those technologies that the consumers can deploy themselves, solar, batteries, EVs, where the action happens. And all of that said, it's also important to say that I don't follow the US that closely, but when you look at projections by analysts who do, they're talking about a reduction of maybe 1/4 in installed capacity as a very rough indication. So we're not talking about 100% the US going from solar and wind to deploying 100% fossil or anything like that. It's still an adjustment of course, not a turnaround. Based on the projections, and these industries do have the tendency to surprise us.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Trump really hates wind. I think we all know that. I was in New York, Lauri, in April, and in New York, in the southern part of Manhattan, there was supposed to be this very large, rather southern part of New York City, there was supposed to be a very large wind turbine facility. So more like import the parts, and that's where they'll be stored so that they can be deployed up the coast to build the wind energy turbines. And that whole thing, I think like $500 million investment. Everything came to a standstill after Trump got elected, and for right reasons, because he is clearly not keen on seeing new wind farms getting built. But at the same time, it's a federal system. When you see what's happening in California, not just California, even Texas, which is like, as red as it gets, it's a very big, vibrant place for wind energy generation. I don't think that's going to end anytime soon either. Lauri, so overall state of green transition. So put the politics and the recent legislation aside, but just general in trend, is the U.S. anywhere close to meeting some of these Paris Climate Accord goals?
The U.S. was just there was hope that it was going to get on track with the Biden administration stuff. So it is going to be a big lift after Trump to get on track to the Paris Agreement commitments. I would not swear on that.
But what about this whole idea that very large companies like Microsoft or Google, they have certain, net zero targets, but they are also one of the biggest spenders on AI. And so I'm hoping that you will also sort of reassure me that these very large companies, their commitment remains undiminished, and the fact that they are going to spend a lot more on data centers, meaning they need more energy, that they will remain committed on generating green energy. Does that sound about right?
I have to say I don't track the companies too closely. I do hope so, but if you compare the trend with preceding the AI boom and preceding Trump, that was great progress. The U.S. was definitely making progress, but still needed to accelerate to get to Paris-aligned trajectories. And so now you have this expectation of increased electricity demand from AI, and you have a hope that those big companies will cover most of that with green energy, but that's still a net effect of that still doesn't have a net effect on the trend. Of course, if the expected massive electricity demand from AI and other types of data centers materializes, and that leads to a boom in green electricity investment, of course, that will be a boost to the industry that could cascade to the rest of the economy. But that's a couple of ifs there. I personally have been a bit skeptical of the current projections of the electricity demand from the AI boom. I mainly track China, where it's really just dwarfed by the demand from traditional industries. But even in other markets, it's dramatic for planners. But efficiency gains in data infrastructure have had a tendency to upset those projections of massive electricity demand. So if you look at the current volume of data streaming, for example, and you go back 10 years, 15 years to what that was supposed to mean in terms of electricity demand, that didn't materialize simply because things got so much more efficient.
That is absolutely fascinating, Lauri. So in about a couple of weeks' time, I will do another podcast with from a very large provider of cloud services in the world. I was doing a warm-up call with him. He said exactly what you just said, that they are also cognizant of the fact that everybody thinks that they're going to become very brown because they have billions and billions of dollars worth of data centers in pipeline. But they said that even from 4 years ago to now, they managed to make their work more efficient, and therefore their increase is not as exponential as people think it is. So I'm really glad you pointed that out. Lauri, I will bring this question back later on when I discuss nuclear with you, but that's a little later. For the timing, let's leave the US behind. Let's talk a little bit about Europe, because regardless of what Trump says, at least so far my understanding is that Europe remains very much committed to green transition. So give us a sense of the present and the future of the green transition journey of Europe.
Overall, things have been accelerating. So for Europe, obviously the move from Putin of cutting off gas supplies to Europe was a big shock and a big realization that we need to move a lot faster especially on the residential and industrial sectors, which have been the major users of gas. It rearranged the priorities a bit. So the old refrain was that we're gonna get rid of coal first, then oil, then gas, and there could even be an increase in gas use as a transition fuel. That's not completely gone away, but obviously the sound of relying on gas has become a lot less attractive. So the priorities have been shifted. Another trend is or at least was before everything that Trump has done in the U.S. was concerned about reliance on components, imports, and reliance on upstream inputs from China, and that's still playing out. But in Europe, it's clear that the priority is to keep the deployment of clean energy going, and then see if we can diversify supply and de-risk supply while doing that. So that's not having a similar effect. The recent drop in solar and battery prices is, I think, the most exciting trend, and resulted in a huge jump in solar installations recently. That has, of course, happened pretty much everywhere except for, well, even in the US to some degree, but more everywhere else where you don't have those prohibitive tariffs. But that's happening in Europe, and I think that's going to accelerate the transition in the power sector. One thing, though, that has happened in Europe is that the power sector, in fact, in aggregate, not in every country, but in aggregate, is starting to be quite clean. The latest tracking from us on Europe's total CO2 emissions showed that we had another double-digit drop in power sector emissions last year, but the overall reduction in emissions was still very modest, a few percent. So the power sector can't do the heavy lifting anymore because it has become such a small share of total emissions, and now a lot more needs to happen in transportation, buildings, and industry. Of course, it's also starting to happen, as I already alluded. So for industry, the gas shock was a big one, and for transportation, EV uptake is accelerating and will help a lot.
I want to ask you a couple of follow-up questions. So starting with the gas shock, it seems to me that in the immediate aftermath of the gas shock or the Ukraine shock or the Russia shock, Europe became very much reliant on both Qatar as well as US in terms of getting LNG and LPG supplies coming in. So is on the margin that is coming down, or it's just way too early to tell? And related to that, all these trade deals that's happening with the US and Europe, I mean, isn't the US also demanding that Europe buy more fossil fuel energy from the US?
That's the old adage about Europe. If I want to speak to Europe, who do I call? And in this case, if I want to sell gas to Europe, who do I send the stuff to? So the people who are negotiating with the US, they don't have money in their pockets to buy gas.
Right.
Of course, there are some things that you can do, but it's mainly the imports of gas from the US surged because so much of that is sold on the spot market. So pretty much all the other exporters do long-term contracts, and then the US sells a lot on the spot market. So they're their swing supplier. And there was also a major reduction in China's gas consumption when Europe was very much short of the stuff. So that led to a redirection of US supplies to Europe. We have had the concern that some of the long-term contracts that are being put in place could be locking in excess supply. So when we're talking about multi decade contracts, then it starts to become a bit fantastical because we do need to get rid of that gas consumption, and it's very hard to see how that would be economical anymore in a few decades. Looking at the way electricity, clean electricity costs are going, and storage costs are going, which are directly competing with gas-fired power plants. So that is a concern, but it you also do need to factor in that Putin cutting off gas supply did leave a massive gap, and filling that with LNG trade. So the overland pipeline imports of gas from Russia to Europe were massive, and filling that up with LNG trade just was always going to gobble up a lot of the LNG cargoes available.
It's fascinating. I will. So one final question before we leave Europe: is there a north-south divide that, when we look at Northern Europe, there are certain aspects related to green transition versus Southern Europe?
There's certainly sitting in Finland. There's certainly a difference between different countries in terms of how much you can get stuff built. So Germany has been talking for as long as I can remember, as long as I've been tracking energy, about connecting the north and the south with transmission lines, but that just doesn't seem to be happening. And at the same time, between the Baltics, the Scandinavia, Finland, and so on, we've had multiple transmission lines built, a much more robust transmission infrastructure. We're quite good at getting wind built in Finland. It's of course a very small place, but for our size, that's attracting a very nice amount of investment and interest in data centers, in green hydrogen, and so on. But I don't think it's a clean cut north-south divide, but there are certainly huge differences between jurisdictions in how long it takes and how hard it is to get permits for these kinds of projects, and that's just going to have a big impact on the industrial geography of Europe, just like everywhere else.
When we were talking earlier about investments on the green infrastructure, especially with respect to wind turbines, are these materials and the technology around wind turbines the ones that are done in Europe, made in Europe, or they're being imported from China?
Europe is still the biggest manufacturer for wind turbines. So there is that's an industry where China's exports are just starting to trickle out of the country. Wind turbines aren't easy to transport, so that's one factor in that. There is, however, an upstream dependency. So the magnets for wind turbines, which rely on heavy rare earth metals, are very highly reliant on China. That's one dependency that will be important to address.
And on solar?
For solar, it's the polysilicon wafer part of the process. So the very upstream part, again, where China has a major dominance, and that seems to be the part that is also hardest to get built elsewhere. So there's, of course, by now China has a technological lead in that. They've been improving the solar supply chains and processes, and a lot of the process innovation has been happening there. So China has developed a genuine technological lead, but there is a systemic factor here, which is that Chinese policymakers have made a very systematic decision to invest in strategic upstream sectors. So those upstream sectors that have a wide variety of applications of course, polysilicon lending itself to both solar panels and semiconductors being one of those. So they've invested state capital with a very high risk tolerance, low return expectations of return, and so on. And these are pretty thankless industries. It's not big value. All the value is downstream. So if you're looking at this simply from how do you make a buck from a specific investment, it's not attractive, especially when China is crowding out the space. So that's the kind of that kind of strategic patience, strategic investment is what is lacking. And it's not, again, it's not many facilities that you need, whether you're talking about rare earths or polysilicon. It's a few plants that you have to build and a few mines, and not huge value in the big scheme of things. But it's just something that you have to have an industrial policy framework to do that. And for example, the EU, the whole rationale for creating the EU was constraining industrial policy. So it's a bit of a reinvention to start having a European industrial policy.
Absolutely fascinating. So let's finish that train of thought before we move on to China, which is, so clearly Trump administration is very concerned on this issue on rare earth supply, and I can see that they're trying all sorts of ways to secure supply from other places. So where is European thinking in that regard?
Well, globally, the rare earth picture has been getting a lot better in terms of diversity of supply. So that scare about China's dominance of rare earths took place a long time ago, and now some of the initiatives are coming to fruition. It's the bottleneck is still with heavy rare earths, so a subset. But that's really starting to happen. Mining is pretty diverse, so it's refining where China has the biggest market share or almost total dominance. So it's building a couple of refineries. It's again, it's low value, thankless work, but it needs to be addressed. Europe as a whole has just agreed on some guidelines, like you don't want to be more than 50% reliant on one supplier and so on, and that can unlock some funding, but there's still some way to go to operationalizing that. To me, it would almost seem like there should be a supplier security agency for these things, like we do for gas and electricity, that would have a mandate to for example, issue contracts for difference or other types of measures to bring supply online.
Well, maybe they're listening to you. Lauri, you have spent many years analyzing and doing research on China. So help us start the process of understanding China's green transition journey. Maybe a couple of data points or a couple of stylized facts that you can think of that allow us to appreciate sort of the scale and the enormity of what China has been up to.
For sure. So the past few years, obviously China was doing a lot of wind and solar, EVs, nuclear already before 2020 or so. But the past few years have just blown past everyone's expectations and projections. So in short, what happened was in 2020, there was an announcement by Xi Jinping that China is going to target carbon neutrality. So that was a top-level political signal. But at the same time, what was happening was there was a clampdown on real estate in China, addressing excess leverage and financial risk. That led to a contraction in the sector. And there was, of course, COVID and the zero COVID policy, which were affecting many sectors, and so these things just left a lot of provincial governments, a lot of state-owned firms, a lot of state-owned banks asking, so where's the action going to be? Where are we going to be investing? Where are we going to be putting all of the money that we would normally put into real estate and these other things that were affected? And everyone basically, because of the high level political signal, because these sectors were had a lot of promise of growth potential and profitability, pretty much everyone landed on clean energy as one of the answers, and that just resulted in an investment boom that no one expected or predicted in terms of its magnitude. And so the amount of solar capacity, for example, that China's deployed multiplied from the already high levels. We're now talking installing almost the entire capacity of Europe in 1 year for solar, and even
just for solar.
Yeah, and so almost Europe's total solar capacity in 1 year, and most importantly, the wind and solar and nuclear installations are reaching a scale where they can cover all or most of China's electricity demand growth. So we're talking about adding about 5% of total annual power generation from those three sources. So that's then that then has the promise of at least stabilizing power sector emissions, because there's no more space for fossil fuels to grow.
I think I read on your website first that I think in both in 23 and 24, China's total production or addition of green energy capacity, not just solar, but solar, wind, hydro, altogether was like 260, 270 gigawatt, which is an unthinkable number. I think, again, to your point, I think your website says it is like bigger than the stock of US green energy capacity.
Exactly. Yeah.
It is absolutely mind-boggling. But Lauri, at the same time, China is massively invested in the fossil fuel economy. And to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't stopped building coal-fired energy plants.
No, not at all. To the contrary. So during the zero COVID period, the permitting and the construction starts of coal-fired power plants accelerated as well. And so there are a couple of reasons for that. The basic logic of the policymakers is that coal-fired power plants provide what is known as dispatchable capacity. So it's capacity that you can turn on and off or adjust up and down as needed, as opposed
to deal with the intermittency issue.
To deal with variations in both demand. So one thing that has been happening in China is massive heat waves, which has resulted in a major increase in the amount of air conditioning that is installed and the usage of those air conditioners. So you have much higher peaks in electricity demand, and of course, you have variation on the supply side from solar and wind. So that's where the perceived need for more thermal power capacity, both coal and gas, comes from. But that is compounded very heavily by the rigidity of China's power grid. So the power grid is still operated in a very inflexible, outdated way, where a lot of things run on schedule. So let's just take an example from Europe. We have so in Northern Europe we have a massive hydro power capacity in Norway and Sweden, and we have a lot of solar capacity in Germany. We have wind capacity here and there, and it's a given that those things operate in tandem. When there's a very sunny day in Germany, then the hydropower plants in Norway and Sweden will generate a lot less to make space for them, and vice versa. But that just doesn't happen in China yet, to the extent that it needs to. You've had cases where, for example, a province is having an electricity shortage. They're having to ration electricity for consumers within the province, but at the same time, they keep exporting a lot of power to other provinces because they have quotas to hit and schedules to meet. The mechanism for just automatically diverting those exports to users within the province just doesn't exist, and a lot of coal plants don't have the incentive to ramp up and down when the amount of wind and solar supply varies. They've been pushed to do that administratively, but they just don't have the economic incentive to do that. So they're avoiding doing that. And all of these kinds of rigidities just mean that you need a lot more coal plants to manage the system than you would if things were running in a flexible way.
Is there also an element of lack of market pricing, which also gets in the way?
Yeah, so that's one way of introducing market pricing. Hourly pricing is one way of making a system work flexibly, because when you have too much supply, for example, then electricity prices will become negative or very low. That will entice coal and gas-fired power plants to shut down and so on. So that's how it works in Northern Europe, for example. China's been working in that direction. There are spot markets in most provinces, for example, but their volumes are still very low. I just described the problem in a way that is trying to be agnostic to the solutions, because I think in China's case, as in any country's case, it's important to remember that the solution that works best in their institutional setting might not be the textbook economic solution.
No, that's a very good point. I mean, that reminds me of the issue related to emissions trading. Even the ETS in Europe, I think, has gone through multiple versions because Europeans themselves have been sort of trying to figure out, do you incentivize volume? Do you incentivize price? Or at the end of the day, does the regulator just set something and expects the market to clear? So let me bring that back into the context of China. Is there a thriving emissions trading market in China? Or if not, what is the current state of affairs?
Right. So there's a market, there's trading, there's money to be made from buying and selling. But what there is not is a carbon price that would actually incentivize anyone to reduce emissions. So that might sound like a bit of a paradox, but so the system first for the first years of its operation, it only covered the power sector, and what it did is it has benchmarks for how much a coal plant should be emitting per unit of electricity produced, and it's differentiated by the size of the coal plant, and there's also a different benchmark for gas plants. And if you're producing at an intensity that is lower than the benchmark, you get excess credits. If you're above, then you have to buy credits. But because it's intensity based, there's no incentive to switch from coal to clean energy, or even coal to gas, or even from less smaller, less efficient coal plants to larger, because those all have different benchmarks, and there's no benchmark for clean energy. So it's only incentivizing slightly more efficient coal plants within each benchmark category, but it's not creating any kind of incentive to switch to clean energy, which is, of course, the main way that you're going to decarbonize the power sector. And now other sectors have been added to the system in a very soft way: steel, cement, aluminum. But for those, it's even more differentiated for each facility. So there's no incentive to switch from coal-based steelmaking to recycled steelmaking from scrap, or hydrogen-based steelmaking.
Lauri, one issue that I struggle with is when people tell me that China's emission is peaking or China's carbon intensity is declining, I could come back and say, oh, that's because the economy is slowing. It's nothing to do with progress with green transition. So how do we balance this seismic progress and adding wind and energy and solar energy capacity, but at the same time keeping on producing coal energy, with this point that actually on the margin, China's emissions are sort of not going up anymore. In fact, they're declining?
Well, two things. So one of them is China's GDP is still growing, if you believe the official numbers, at about 5%. And I kind of do because energy demand and electricity demand are going up at high rates. The other thing is unpacking the economy, which tends to drive me a bit mad when people just say the economy is doing this or that, because from the energy perspective, the different sectors of the economy are completely different animals. If you have strong growth in let's say the restaurant sector, that's very different from having a strong growth in the steel sector, because the latter will produce orders of magnitude more CO2 per unit of economic output. And so China has had in the past 1.5 years, which is when emissions have stabilized and started to come down, China still have had above average growth in both electricity demand and total energy demand. So from that perspective, China's at the point where if you don't have the kind of economic slowdown that would bring down energy demand growth, and if you maintain clean energy additions at the rate that was achieved in the past couple of years, then that's going to be enough to start bringing emissions down.
What is the outlook 2030, 2035? Where do you see China going in terms of emissions?
I think the range of likely outcomes is from a slow, bumpy decline. So of course you will have ups and downs in emissions, but overall the trend will be plateauing and slowly coming down to actually starting to bring emissions down substantially, and that depends on the pattern of economic growth. So a lot of analysts at the moment are looking at the very energy-intensive pattern of economic growth that China had during and right after zero COVID, and expecting that to continue. And I'm leaning towards expecting the distortions that were introduced to the structure of the economy during and after zero COVID to actually unwind. So you would have less energy-intensive growth going forward when the service economy and so on recovers. But that's a longer-term perspective. It's now not doing great again because of the tariffs and other factors. But so, and then the other question is what will the level of clean energy additions be? And so there's been concern. China recently changed the way that new wind and solar producers are compensated, and that led to a huge rush to install before the deadline for the change, and now there's been a bit of a slowdown, but and projections have varied quite widely of what the future will look like. But on that, I'm tending on the optimistic side, mainly because of the massive economic bet that China has made collectively on the clean energy economy. So the massive investment in new manufacturing capacity, transmission lines, EV charging infrastructure, all of these things. It's just hard to see all of that being completely undercut by the policymakers letting the market contract. So I think they will manage it in a way that keeps the boom going.
Lauri, a couple of quick side notes. One is, while your focus and your institution's focus on particulate emission, from my latest visits to China, I feel that we should also think in terms of noise pollution, because in a place like Shanghai or Beijing, running in the morning is just so easy now. because the cars don't make any sound. And I think somebody who spends time there would always want to come back to their city and demand that their city becomes quiet like that. And it's as good as clean air is the quietness of the city because of the cars not making noise. The second one I just want to share with you is that I was talking to a CEO of SOE in Beijing last year, and to the point, because you said talked about battery and transmission. So his company does wind turbines, but he wants to provide end-to-end solution to his customers, and hence he's investing in high voltage transmission lines as well as next generation of battery storage. And I was very impressed that it was a holistic way he was looking at green transition, not just one area. So related to that, Larry, is China and tech innovation on the green space. Give us a sense of where the state of the art is in the tech side on battery, on transmission, on EVs, on of course solar and wind.
In those kind of boring industries, the back end industries like making solar panels and so on, the product will look pretty much the same as it did 5 years ago. But the increase in efficiency, the reduction in the thickness of the panel, so the material inputs that go into it has been amazing. And so one thing that someone told me some time ago is, I hear about all these breakthroughs in solar. There's always news about the researcher developed a more efficient solar panel or whatnot. I don't know what happens to those. And the answer is they become the mainstream in a few years. So it's a continuous breakthrough in making the stuff more efficient, both in terms of converting sunlight into electricity, but also in terms of the amount of polysilicon that you need, for example, and that's resulting in reduced cost and of course a reduced CO2 footprint from manufacturing as well. So basically, I think a continuous breakthrough that you don't notice as the end user is the way to characterize those sectors, and simply by virtue of so much of the manufacturing being located in China, the majority of that kind of quiet optimization has taken place in China, and they're the ones who've been pushing the frontier on that, on consumer-oriented tech like EVs. It's much more noticeable, and I think it's just as you said, it's very hard to try an EV, especially in a place with good charging infrastructure and so on, and say that I think I'm going to go back to
No chance.
petrol vehicles or horse carts or servants carrying me around in whatever those things are called. It's just it just seems like that's that's yesterday's stuff.
Oh yeah. So as somebody who just gave up his Audi Q5 for a BYD Line 7, I know exactly where you're coming from. I mean, what was I waiting for all these years? It's really, really amazing to drive these vehicles, and especially now. I mean, to the point of the consumer-facing aspect, the Teslas of the world brought EVs to us, and we will always be grateful to Musk for doing that. But they weren't fun cars to drive in the sense that they were not very human-centric in their design. And inside was kind of cheap and very overly minimalistic. The BYD that I have is like such a different level from that, Lauri. When you come to Singapore, I'll drive you around. Or maybe you have the Line 7s in Finland already, and you can see them on the streets. But what about in terms of storage? Because that's just one complaint that everybody says, that, oh, well, at night there is no solar, when there's no wind, there's no wind power. We need better battery technology. Are battery technologies getting progressively better?
Well, they've gotten a lot cheaper, and that's the main thing that matters. So yeah, battery prices are now coming down to less than $100 per kilowatt hour, which is the level that was some time ago. That was projected for 2030. Go some time back, and that was projected for never, I think. So it's happened very, very fast. And in China, in fact, I would argue that battery storage has started to happen too fast, in the sense that if you look at an economically optimized system, they wouldn't need that amount of batteries yet. but because of the rigidities in the grid, it's already starting to happen. We're talking about more than 70 gigawatts of battery storage capacity installed, most of that last year at the end of the year, and of course more coming on this year. And the other reason that it's happening, you could say that it's happening too fast, is that many of those batteries lack the price signals to actually operate in the way that would benefit the system the most. So there's basically batteries that have been put in place and that are still waiting to get the price signals to start doing the work that they should be doing. But at least it's showing that it can be deployed at scale, and as the expansion of solar and wind hits grid bottlenecks because of those inflexibilities, then more storage and also more green hydrogen production will start to happen. So one thing that is very much happening in China and around which there's a lot of hype is so-called virtual power plants. So that's a way of getting around the lack of proper electricity markets. So you bundle together solar, possibly wind, storage, some thermal power, and you bundle those together into a virtual power plant that can then make a contract with a buyer for 24/7 electricity. So it's a way of packaging, especially solar and storage, for a market that trades monthly volumes. And I expect that in those provinces where the solar and wind expansion is hitting constraints created by the grid, green hydrogen projects will also take off much faster than expected as a way of keeping the boom going.
Lauri, I have a friend in Singapore. He's an engineer in the marine sort of offshore wind turbine projects, and he's done work on Taiwan and Japan, I think also in Korea. So I just wanted to ask you, all this sort of, seismic changes that are happening in China, is it beginning to have a positive spillover impact in North Asia and East Asia?
That varies quite a bit by country. I think the most dramatic impact has been, or I don't think that's a bit of analysis that I did, that the most dramatic impact is being felt in Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, even Latin America. So that's where there's very strong growth in China's exports of clean energy technology, and also plans for overseas manufacturing. South Asia as well. For example, Pakistan had a massive solar boom, and now it's starting to have a storage boom because the conditions were ripe, so to speak, very unreliable and expensive grid electricity. In East Asia, well, that's a big case study, but the Japan, Korea markets, for example, they're regulated markets where things happen a lot more slowly. So I would say those are more examples of markets where the grid planners just need to sit down and do the math on how much solar and batteries, for example, they should be doing if you optimize economically, and they're still way behind what they should be doing.
Yeah, I find that a bit frustrating, because you would think that they suffer from equal amount of energy insecurity as does China, because they don't have any oil or gas, so they have to import everything, and maybe they just probably have less of a geopolitical urgency than China does on this issue. But I find it interesting that you mentioned Middle East. I'll share with you one anecdote. I was visiting Dubai a few months ago, and a friend who had solar cells panels on his rooftop, he was telling me that Dubai summers are getting progressively hotter. So at 50 degrees Celsius, his solar panels are actually not very efficient. But
Yeah.
The Chinese have come up with solutions for higher temperature solar panels, so he's going to be replacing them with the new ones. And that innovation, I don't think anybody else is doing other than the Chinese.
Yeah, no, that's one thing that if you go to pretty much any African or other emerging market, you see that it's not just, Chinese stuff isn't just cheaper. A lot of Chinese companies are putting a lot of effort into carving out a space in those markets, and they're actually good at localizing and going to markets that Western companies have neglected or put too little effort into.
Lauri, earlier I told you that I want to come to the issue of nuclear, so maybe now is the time. So we've talked a lot about wind and solar. We've talked a lot about a battery. In the US, it seems like nuclear is back in vogue. Not really sure where the Europeans stand. I'm not really sure where the Chinese stand. So help us sort of understand that part of the story.
I think in China's case, it's quite clear. There's been 3 years in a row of 10 new reactor projects being permitted. So it's very much a part of the mix in China. Of course, if you compare 10 gigawatts per year of nuclear to 250 gigawatts of solar, it's still solar is the bigger one by far, but it's very clearly a part of the mix. And I think for China, the fact that the clean electricity boom stands on 3 legs, so you have solar, wind, nuclear, is most definitely a good thing. China has strong advantages in nuclear. They're good at mobilizing finance, permitting, and so on, mega projects, and their nuclear industry has a volume that they can deliver projects at a predictable time scale and price. The case for most other countries is that the nuclear industry is not there. So if you want to get nuclear projects moving, you have to get to over the initial bump and get from doing pilot projects, one-off projects, to having a pipeline, and having all the human resources and so on. Europe is very divided. So you've got countries like Germany that are where a lot of the population is vehemently anti-nuclear, to countries that are very keen. A lot of Central European countries have active nuclear ambitions. In Finland, we just had a reactor completed, and now have a very high share of nuclear as well. Sweden is having a debate about whether they should replace some of the aging reactors and so on. But yeah, for countries that don't have that well-oiled industry that can deliver, is making the economic case is a lot harder. But it's so yeah. What I tell everyone is it's nice work if you can get it, and you just have to be realistic about the costs and the hurdles to getting the first few reactors off the ground. The other thing is that when we do start to get to think about how the power system is going to work at a near 100% clean electricity, there is a lot of value in having nuclear as a part of the mix, especially for countries that have weak solar in the winter and have high electricity demand in the winter, especially Northern Europe. For other countries that have round the year sun and you just need batteries to make it 24/7. It's a lot harder to make the economic case.
Lauri, I just recently read a very critical article on China's new plans to expand its hydro capacity. You know, the one big thing they want to build in Tibet. What's your sense on hydro?
Well, China, no matter what you do, China's not going to get a massive amount of more electricity. Well, it's massive, of course. The latest dam project is absolutely massive. It's one of the biggest things ever built, but or plans to be. But still, in terms of the scale of China's power system, there's just not a whole lot more that you can build. So if I was making those choices, I would probably say that that the ecological and geopolitical costs outweigh the risks there, and because China's built so much hydro already. Most of the hydro construction now is in pumped hydro storage, but there's a few remaining places where you can build. Big dams are being pursued as well.
Right. Lauri, I'm cognizant of time. I know that you have other duties to attend to. Just want to finish our discussion in the context of emerging markets, maybe with a focus on India. On your sense, you've already talked about how China is helping a large part of Middle East and Africa and South Asia push through green transition. Let's talk a little bit of India and just an overall comment on where we're going.
So India was the first and most systematic in trying to build their own solar industry. That has slowed down deployment, to be sure, because we've had tariffs on Chinese supply, and the domestic supply hasn't been online yet. It's starting to come online now, and that should improve the picture. I hope there's a lot more investment on that side. It's good for the world, and good for, at least in terms of India being comfortable in going big on solar. It's good to have more domestic supply, but so that should be accelerating. One thing though that has been happening in India is the country's economic growth pattern has been the polar opposite of China. So there's been a lot of development in the non-energy intensive side, and now there's been more of a construction boom. So quite a bit of energy demand from steel and cement and so on, and emissions. So and now we do see a risk of that being overdone in terms of the expectations of the construction boom continuing, leading to building much more coal-based steel capacity, for example, than is needed at a time when it's in India. It's certainly still hard to make the case for non-coal-based steel making, but things are going to look very different in a decade. But so big kind of lock-in risks there, and also with coal, what happened a decade ago is the private sector pulled back from coal-fired power, but the state sector, more because of politics and in this institutional lock-in, keeps pushing that. Again, at a time when the economic case for that is extremely hard to make. So certainly a mixed bag. But I'm quite certain that in 5 years the economic race between coal and clean energy in India will be resolved in everyone's minds, and those investments that are being forced through the pipeline right now are going to look quite misguided on the coal power side, and that would unfortunately be the second time that India's banking system, for example, takes a big hit from overinvestment in coal-fired power. So, still hoping that some of that can be avoided.
Very good point. I really hope that, I know that it's naive to expect India and China to get along on everything, but on this area, I really hope and pray that India and China find common ground, the Chinese technology, as well as some degree of consultation. Because, Lauri, every particulate emission in China, sooner or later, will end up to a large extent in India. So I think they should cooperate and work things out. And I think the Chinese tech can be very, very helpful to India, and India sort of has to make up its mind about whether it wants it or not. Final point. overall EM, which always seems to be a bit of an underthought or developing world? What's happening there?
Yeah, that is a big question, and I do, especially Indonesia. I think is massively underreported in every domain. But unfortunately, well, it's the signals are confusing from the new leadership. So there was just an update of Indonesia's power development plan, which is very business as usual, very low targets, almost absurdly low for clean energy, especially solar, and at the same time, very big, bold statements from President Prabowo. So he's been saying he wants to close down fossil power plants. He wants Indonesia to be 100% clean in terms of electricity, but at the same time pushing a lot of oil and gas projects. So sounds like an all of the above approach from Prabowo, but unfortunately, the institutional setting under him just very heavily favors coal and fossil fuels. So if he wants to see even all of the above happen, he needs to put a lot more emphasis on making the clean side happen and holding especially the state power utility PLN accountable. Maybe knowing that there's a lot of EMs in the world, I'll just say that Brazil seems to be at the other end. So they've really emerged as a leader. They're one of those. So they had, of course, have a very hydro heavy power mix, but another place where you just can't build a whole lot more hydro, and they have successfully transitioned to building wind and solar to cover much of the, or even all of the growth in electricity demand. So that's very positive. Also very strong growth starting to happen in EVs. So all in all, on the energy side, very positive trends. Of course, in the broader climate picture and air pollution picture, the forest sector is a whole different story. But I think that's for another conversation.
Yeah, unfortunately, the forest sector in Indonesia is also a big source of my concern. But Lauri, I cannot thank you enough for this insights. I need to have you back because there are a bunch of other areas that I want to talk about. We didn't have the time today. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think it was a great conversation.
Yes, and thanks to our listeners as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge. Violet Lee and Daisy Sharma produced additional assistance. All 158 episodes of the podcast are available on YouTube and all major podcast platforms. This is for information only, does not constitute any trade advice. For our research publication, you can find them all in DVS Research Library. Take care, everybody.